This is a Pasco Media production. Please visit pascomedia.com.
In Latin, Renovo means to renew, restore, or revive. This is the show where we explore the miraculous nature of the mundane as we look at one part of the Catholic tradition to help you engage more fully in the practice of faith. Past episodes are available at renovopodcast.com. I am Doug Tuke, and this is the greatest show that we've ever recorded ever. Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo! Because we're talking about beer and Catholics and monks, right? Right? Come on, church. Get excited with me, okay? I like good beer, and I really like monks, and I love that the two things together form happiness and wonderful history, okay? Work with me, people. I have a really dear friend, the executive director of Cultivation Ministries, Frank Mercadante, whom I adore, and a lot of people don't know. He's a master brewer. I mean, it's not just recreation bucket beer, you know what I'm saying? I mean, this guy has a triple tap in his kitchen, okay? He has the greatest wife in the world, people. Okay, no, he brews two gallons at a time, and I'm not a beer connoisseur as much as I just kind of know what I like. But I'll tell you what, some of the beer he has brewed is like top 10 for me ever. Like, it's that good, and he got me fired up about the idea of tradition in brewing and the church, which, of course, I love, because who wouldn't? Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about today, and I'm excited about that because I think it's one of those things that we, like Catholics, we're the life of the party, man. We're the life of the party when it comes to just that ability to celebrate both Christ present on the earth, but also Christ in heaven and His plan for us. And I love that the history of spirit, in moderation, comes from our monastic tradition. All right, let's get in there because it's going to be a good time. Listen, let me just start with this. If you love beer, then you need to love monks, okay? Because the bottom line is that they've been producing beer for like 1,500 years, okay? And in that time, not just are they making it, they've actually revolutionized and basically perfected the process, okay? And you know what's great about this is, secular or not, brewmasters would, there's no argument here. Like, you can be the most atheist secular brewmaster and be like, yeah, no, we kind of owe it to the Trappist, you know, because of how awesome they are. So beer is the oldest recipe recorded in the world. So we know this. The ancient Egyptians first documented the brewing process on papyrus rolls around 5,000 BC. And these were the first beers. They were brewed with things like dates and pomegranates and other kind of like indigenous herbs, and were probably pretty nasty by today's standards. I can't stand the modern sour. This is like a joke between Frank and I. They were probably worse than sours. Okay, and if you like sours, you're weird. You're just weird. All right, that's all I have to say. Write me an email. Tell me how awful I am. I can't wait. So the Egyptians used beer for ceremonies, for religious ceremonies with the pharaoh, and kind of directing the brewing schedule and distributing their beer to the masses. That was part of it was political, but it was also religious. And you can actually call pharaohs the first brewmasters in many ways because they monitored the process. But before the Egyptians, there's these primitive cultures of Mesopotamia that are believed to have actually been the very, very, very first brewers, though they didn't bother to write anything down. And that was like 10,000 BC. All they left behind were malted barley scraps and bowls with beer-like residue in them that have been found, which is pretty cool. So the residue was probably the remnants of like a grain porridge that had basically fermented naturally with some kind of wild yeast, which would have imparted a pretty intoxicating effect on whoever ate it or drank it or repeated the process repeatedly while watching the Super Bowl or whatever they did in 10,000 BC. One of the first discoveries of just kind of the early brewing industry was that using one container for all fermentations produced a way better, way more reliable result. So the earliest kind of chemically confirmed barley beer dates between 3,500 and 3,100 BC, and was actually discovered in Iran, in the central Zagros mountains of Iran. And tablets discovered in Syria dating all the way back to 2500 BC, actually indicate that the city of Elba produced a ton of different beers. And it was actually pretty common for female brewers to double up as priestesses. And actually some beers were like specially brewed for those religious ceremonies. So it's actually been grounded in some sort of pagan wackiness for a really long time. And then beer eventually makes its way from the Middle East across the Mediterranean, finally to Europe, where it's become basically an integral part of life. Okay. So this was especially true in Northern Europe, where like a lot of barley crops provided a lot of raw ingredients for brewers. Okay, so beer was valued both nutritionally. Okay, it was like nutritional value specifically because it was safe. It was a safe alternative to drinking water, and a lot of sources had been contaminated by human waste, certainly in the Middle Ages. So it was during these early Middle Ages that what we think of as like modern beer was born. That's where it came out of. Okay, now brewers had been using malted barley as the main source of fermentable sugar for hundreds of years, okay? But the use of hops as like a bittering and a flavoring agent actually didn't really become common until around the 12th century. Now, before that time, lots of different herbs and spices were used to kind of balance sweet malt in beer, everything from spruce boughs to dried flowers to bitter roots. They've all been found in brew kettles, okay? Around 1150, however, German monks began using wild hops in beer, and it totally caught on, okay? That's the big contribution, okay? And brewers found that the hops actually added like awesome flavor, which is great. It's thirst-quenching bitterness, and added the benefit of hops actually acted as kind of like a natural preservative, extending the life of the beers. We'll talk more about that later on. So monks were a huge preeminent brewers in the Middle Ages, which like virtually every monastery had a brewery on site. Now, historians credit monks with a lot of brewing innovations beyond just hops, including the idea of lagering or cold storing the beer to improve the flavor. So even in modern times, the monastic brewing tradition really basically still holds. It's basically still kind of the practice with a ton of Belgian monasteries today still ranking among the greatest breweries in the world. Okay, let's talk about the Trappists. This is a big deal because they really kind of own it. Like they own like their own policies for what great beer is. Okay, the Order of Cistercians was founded in 1098 when monks from the Benedictine Abbey of Molesme. I can't say that right. It's something like that. Molesme. All right. Well, anyway, they left to form their own monastery in nearby Citeaux, France, Cistercian in Latin. So it's the name of the town. Feeling that basically things were getting kind of too lax, and they wanted to return to the real stricter order, and they wished to return specifically together. Okay. So Saint Benedict called specifically in his order for austerity and manual labor, and the monks sought to return to basically kind of a quiet life of prayer, which they live by the fruits of their labors, specifically. And that was their identity. That's what they wanted. Self-denial, emphasizing love, work, prayer, and that's who they are. So from a very early stage, the Cistercians acquired lands to develop and farm with their own hands. Now, a lot of this work basically included vineyards. So they were working with their hands, but like a lot of it was vineyards. And as the order kind of spread, the Cistercians got way more popular. Each abbey was essentially autonomous, except for kind of the guiding charter that all the abbeys of the order basically followed. Okay, so now hoping to attract Cistercian monks to their lands, lots of nobles would offer the order undeveloped land in hopes that the monks could actually turn the wild into sort of a socioeconomic hub for where they live, where the lords lived. And by 1152, there were 333 Cistercian monasteries in Europe. That's amazing, okay? That's amazing, all right? By their peak in the 1300s, they were the most powerful religious order in Europe. The Cistercians essentially reached kind of the zenith of their influence in 1335 when a Cistercian was elected Pope, Benedict the 12th. Okay. Now, after this, the Cistercian order began a steady decline, and that was kind of accelerated by the Reformation and the French Revolution, which almost ended the order. But here's the thing. With the main group of Cistercian abbeys kind of going into decline, La Grande Trappe Abbey in Normandy, France, began to institute reforms under their abbots starting in 1664. And the reforms, like the initial reforms of the Cistercians in 1098, basically intended to return the wayward order to a truer form of Benedictine monasticism. So it was like a reform of the reform, okay? And those following in the footsteps of La Trappe became known as Trappists. And the nuns were referred to as Trappistines. All right, now like the main order of Cistercians in France, the French Revolution, right, the rule of Napoleon, created a lot of chaos as all these church lands were confiscated and the monks were basically forced to run away. The Trappists scattered around Europe trying to find safe harbor, but they failed as Napoleon basically spread across all over Europe. And the wandering helped to spread the Trappists into Belgium and into the new world of the newly formed United States. So after Napoleon's defeat in 1815, the monks began returning to France. And those that stayed in Belgium, however, they eventually kind of separated from the rule of the French monks to form their own Belgian congregation. In 1892, the Trappists officially parted ways with the Cistercians, and their independence was essentially recognized by the Pope, which is great. The old Cistercians were then known as the Order of Cistercians of the Standard Observance, while the Trappists became known as the Order of the Cistercians of the Strict Observance. And today, the Trappists have grown to nearly like 170 monasteries and convents all over the world. So while monks led a pretty solitary life of work and prayer, Trappists, bring it on, right? They believed in hospitality and charity above all things, and monasteries became kind of renowned as places of refuge for travelers looking for safe, clean place, decent food, drink, and the likes. The monks grew or started to trade their food and made like their own drinks. Thus, beer and wine were readily available at all the monasteries. And at this point in time, water was unsanitary, all right? It carried a whole lot of disease. We talked about that before, right? The act of brewing beer sanitized the water and added like a lot of nutrients into this beverage of choice, right? So beer and wine were safe to drink and an important part of everyone's diet, okay? In 820, the St. Gall Monastery designed what would become the template for the medieval monastic brewing. So I'm going back in time here, but this is where that standard came from. The design designated the construction of 3 breweries, one to brew beer for paying customers and travelers, one to make the monks' own beer, and one to make beer for the poor or charity beer. How cool is that? So each brewery brewed a different quality of beer, with the charity beer being the one made from the least desirable materials. And this eventually led to kind of the idea of a multiple running system. So a medieval monk, most likely Cistercian, they wore white habits, created that idea way back when. And that system had found its way through all those monasteries all the way up until that later 17th century, which is kind of incredible. So eventually the monks figured out you could run water through the mash from the beer multiple times to get more use from the grains. And this was discovered, it was documented by the Jesuit brewers who offered a 5% to travelers and used the 2.5% second run of the beer for themselves. The next big step in the kind of modernization of brewing practices came when they realized that people would pay a lot more for a stronger beer, more than the cost of the extra grain that it would take to make it. How crazy is that? So this allowed even bigger beers with more runnings, like big flavorful beer. So the first runoff would be the richest and brew the best beer. And then the second would be next best. And the final running would be the weakest. And again, the first would go to the guest to be sold to help maintain the abbey. They were making money on this, right? The second would be for the monks, God bless them. And then the last would be for the poor. And this is also kind of the likely origin for the terms single, double, triple, and quadruple in terms of malt, okay? So this tradition of kind of like self-sustainability coupled with hospitality, which is fantastic, continued way into Belgium as the Belgian Trappist spread across Europe and in the aftermath of the French Revolution and all the Napoleonic Wars. So since the monks couldn't really grow wine grapes effectively, and the lowlands, Belgium and Netherlands, were beer-dominated cultures, these kind of newly established monasteries focused on beer as a way to maintain their abbeys. Brilliant, right? All right, so the next big step in beer quality, which kind of starts to take a little bit of a departure from basically what the monks contributed, is this. There was an influx of in the 20th century, lower alcohol, foreign beers, got a big following in Belgium. And like Belgian breweries were basically going out of business at a really fast pace because they couldn't keep up and they just couldn't produce for inexpensive costs. So this time this is where we start to see the Trappist kind of stepping to the fore by offering beer that was higher in alcohol and way more flavorful than all these other competitive beers. And this was also basically just kind of exacerbated by the 1919 law banning liquor sales in Belgian bars. That was awful. The Trappists were poised to kind of take advantage of the law. So with a high alcohol liquor option, patrons turned towards high alcohol beers, mainly made by the monks. And as more breweries went out of business, the demand for the monks' beer grew steadily as all these other alternatives kind of left the market. So while being largely conservative in regards to any kind of change, the monks were actually really fast to adopt these new techniques and equipment to basically ensure the quality of their product continued to grow. And the monks, this is amazing, believe that since they're essentially working for God and in his name, they should make the best possible product they could make. So they had a really high work etiquette when it came to beer. And this has been kind of a driving principle throughout the history of all monastic orders, that they really have these disciplined processes still in place today to make their beer. Side note, the Paulaner monks of Bavaria actually went so far as to produce a beer especially for consumption during Lent, which is fantastic. Trappist beers are brewed in accordance with the Cistercian Order of the Strict Observance. You got to check that out. And they're set out by the La Trappe Monastery in France, 1685. Beer is made on site at abbey or monastery. And there's specific rules in place to be able to call your beer a Trappist beer. That is amazing. That is so amazing. Another side note, which is kind of fun, like along with like Northern European countries like Germany and Belgium, the British Isles became a real brewing center, and a lot of that had to do with monastic life there. Lots of styles of beer that we know of today came out of Britain. Pale ales, porters, stouts. They've been brewed in England and Ireland for hundreds of years. It's a big part of British life, actually, that the British Army issued daily beer rations to soldiers, which is kind of crazy. And when the British Empire occupied half the civilized world, the Royal Navy delivered beer to troops in even the furthest corners of the empire. In fact, and this is my favorite little point of information, my favorite style of beer, an Indian Pale Ale, an IPA, developed out of the need to ship beer from England to the faraway posts of the empire, like India and Burma, without it going stale or sour. So British brewers discovered that a beer with higher alcohol and extra hops, both of which act as natural preservatives, lasted longer and basically could survive the long journey to all the other side of the globe, which makes IPA the farthest, most superior beer on the planet. Bring on the emails. I cannot wait to hear your complaints. Ha! How great is this? I'm so thankful for monks. My favorite Trappist beer is Chimay, which a lot of you you've heard of. It's pretty fantastic. Chimay Red, I think that's my favorite one. I can't remember Chimay Blue is good too. There's all these different colors that go with it. But I'll tell you what, how thankful are we that a disciplined society of folks like dedicated themselves through the purposes of hospitality and charity to perfect, really, the practices of brewing, all in the name of church, people. Talk about the mundane being miraculous. That might be my favorite show of all time. Go have a beer if you're of age and enjoy it, and thank a monk. Woohoo! Don't forget to visit renovopodcast.com for past episodes. Please subscribe to, review, and rate our podcast. We always appreciate your input. Your topic suggestions, questions, and/or comments are always welcome at doug@renovopodcast.com. Learn more about me at dougtuke.com or on Twitter and Instagram at DTOOKE and the number 1. Friends, always remember to engage the tradition, a tradition that includes Trappist monks making beer, woohoo, and live the conversion. Until next time, God bless.